media has a way of latching on to certain terms. So, for example, critical race theory, this term has become a new boogeyman, and it becomes this way to attack anything that is trying to criticize status quo or those in power. And that's at its heart what ethnic studies does, is it gives us a chance to criticize the status quo, to make a better world for us. Why is it that Asian Americans or Asians at large have been used as wedges, as racial wedges, to create, to detract from solidarity, to stop solidarity from happening? It's because they're being used to uphold white supremacy, and to hide the fact that white supremacy, imperialism, capitalism is why these communities are placed in these situations in the first place.
Eunice, thank you so much for coming onto the show. You are an ethnic studies learner and educator and the co-lead for the AAPI chapter of Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Consortium, aka LESMCC. I'm really excited to have you on the show to talk about your insights on everything that's going on with all these attacks happening to educators around the country. I want us to talk about the AAPI community and so much more. But first, I kind of want to check in and to see how you're handling all this chaos. So for our audience members who might not know the depths of what's going on, can you briefly explain what's happening and how would you describe the urgency or the threat level of what's happening?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. Also nervous, but I think it'll be fun. I guess as a brief overview, so I'll go back to the 1960s, actually. So the 1960s is when we found ethnic studies movements starting, right? We had students of color, groups of students of color from various communities coming together and saying that they wanted ethnic studies in their education. They wanted their stories reflected in their classrooms. And so since the 60s, we've had like community members, activists, educators, students, all pushing for ethnic studies in various forms. And that brings us over the years to today, where I'm based in California, so specifically California a couple years ago passed a requirement to have ethnic studies as a graduation requirement. And so since then, different districts have been trying to figure out what that looks like. How do we train teachers? How do we create those courses? How do we roll that out in like effective ways, right? So it's been difficult, to say the least. Some of the things that have been happening recently is that ethnic studies has always been a contested field of study, and now that it's a requirement, there's a lot of controversy around it. A lot of groups, right-wing groups, are not happy that it's happening, and so in particular, the group that I'm part of that you mentioned, Liberated Ethnic Studies, is made up of a group of scholars who originally were part of the planning team to create the model curriculum for our state. And so as that curriculum was actually modified without their permission, they separated and created our own organization. I wasn't part of the original organization. I was brought in afterwards. And so once we created our own, our kind of theme or message is nothing about us without us is for us. So how do we create that curriculum on our terms and make sure that the experts are in the room, and that our voices are not being silenced? So yeah, hopefully that's a good overview.
And so if we're looking at this timeline, since this dates back so many decades ago to now, how would you describe the climate that we're in at the moment, with so many educators being personally attacked, with so many big right-wing organizations pumping in a lot of money? Would you say this is business as usual, or would you say this is something different?
I mean, I don't think it's anything new. I'm a history teacher, so at heart, I always look back to movements before to make sense of what's happening now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so looking at, like, I know you mentioned recently in a different podcast about the AP African American Studies being in Florida, right? The ban of it, and but I don't know. I think media has a way of latching on to certain terms. So, for example, critical race theory, this term has become a new boogeyman, and it becomes this way to attack anything that is trying to criticize status quo or those in power. And that's at its heart what ethnic studies does, is it gives us a chance um, to criticize the status quo, to make a better world for us. And so when that happens, um, the powers that be or the media latches on and then um, tries to control the narrative around what ethnic studies is. So it's really my heart as an ethnic studies teacher to make sure that people know what ethnic studies is and what we're all about, and that it's about love and it's about centering our communities and our stories, and it's about making a better world for ourselves, our community members, our neighbors, our loved ones, and then our future descendants, right? What world are we trying to create? So I don't think it's new. So what gives me hope is that throughout the struggle through the years, there's always been people and community members who will continue to fight alongside each other. And it's just a matter of looking for those stories and centering those stories so that they're not kind of left out of the limelight. And to know that we're still here, right? We're still going to fight for what's right and fight for our loved ones, for ourselves, for our communities.
And you were mentioning that, looking through our history, this is a consistent theme that happens all the time, this back and forth. As an ethnic studies educator who knows what both overt and more discrete forms of systemic injustice looks like, uh, what is your analysis of what's happening right now with CRT, with the weaponization of woke being this catch-all term, and then ultimately what happens next?
Um, that's a great question. I think I'll just start by saying that like a lot of my thinking is informed by Black radical theorists and scholars and educators who have come before me. So I'm always looking to people who know more than me. And so what comes next, I'm not sure. But like I said, I mentioned I look to movements in the past. So I'm thinking about how during the Third World Liberation Front, um, for example, there was a group called I think, Intercollegiate Chinese for Social Action, ICSA, that identified that the kids in Chinatown were not getting the education that they needed or not getting Chinese American history, right? So they created an initiative called FUCKU, Free University for Chinatown Kids Unincorporated, and very explicitly we're like, we're going to create the curriculum for our kids by ourselves, right? We know the university is not going to do it, so we're going to do it ourselves. And then there's another group called PACE, the Philippine American Collegiate Endeavor, same idea. How do we recruit Filipino youth into college? How do we give them ethnic studies curriculum when we know the university is not going to do it? And those two orgs obviously were working eventually in collaboration with like BSU, Black Student Union, right, and other groups that came together to identify what they needed for their community. And I think so these kinds of pockets of community organizations or initiatives really reflect this, for me, this idea of like fugitivity, which comes from the Black radical tradition. And this idea of refusing standards that are placed on us, refusing expectations that are placed on us. And when systems or systems of power, institutions are not going to give us what we need, right, for our communities, we're going to do it ourselves. So what's next? I'm not sure, but like I said before, I really feel like there are always going to be teachers who are going to do the right thing, right? There are always going to be activists and organizers who are pushing for curriculum that do reflect ourselves. And yeah, we'll see. I have a lot of hope because I think what gives me hope is being in community with people who I know are continuing the struggle. Um, so I think part of it is also organizing, community organizing, and making sure that we strategically work together so that right? So that when we're divided, we know that it's easier to divide and conquer. But if we work together, like we saw in Third World Liberation Front, there's something really powerful in working together across communities.
I love that thread of optimism. I think it's easy to look at a lot of these things that are happening and feel like there's this wave coming at you. And for the people who are in the eye of that storm, who are possibly being targeted or who are following what's happening to educators, what advice do you have for those people who are experiencing that right now, who are being targeted? Like, who do you reach out to? How do you, deal with that internally? Any advice?
Um, I really think it's just being community. Don't be alone, right? Don't do the work alone. Find your allies on campus or outside of campus. Find people that will support you politically, but also emotionally. It's really taxing to feel if you're feeling alone, right? So just find the right people and be in community. Um, it's hard work. I don't have an easy answer for that.
And
Yeah.
so next, I kind of want to shift over. Next, I kind of want to shift over to uh, identity and the Asian community, and I'd love to hear your opinion on the term AAPI.
Mhm.
Do you feel like this is an appropriate term? Do you feel like we need a term that's more sufficient, or is it like a fruitless game to try to boil us down into a single term?
Um, Yeah, AAPI is really interesting to me. First of all, we know the term Asian American came from also the 1960s, right? The first emergence of it was the AAPA, Asian American Political Alliance of young Asian American activists and organizers who were inspired by the Black Power movement and decided, look, we need a term to be in solidarity with each other and with them, right? And so that's where the term Asian American came from. Um, at that time, I think a lot of the organizers and students were largely East Asian and Filipino students. And as we're like over the years, as we get more immigration from other groups, right? Um, it becomes the question of, does this term, like you said, does this term encompass all of us? And then in the 1990s, the census added Pacific Islanders, so it became AAPI. Um, I don't know if you've heard of the term euphemism treadmill, or this idea like we're always trying to find out new terms to serve us and our needs. And so terms evolve over time, right? And I think when we're thinking about AAPI, I don't think it's just about being politically correct or it's just about finding the right term. I don't know if the right term will ever be there, but I think it's about affirming our agency, who gets to name ourselves, right? Our dignity and our humanity. And then also strategically figuring out how to use terms to as a strategy for political education, right? How do we analyze how language and power intersect? Is AAPI a term that encompasses all communities? If, for example, Pacific Islanders or even South Asians have often been excluded from the dialogue and from the conversation. So yeah, to your question of is it a fruitless game? Maybe. But I think there are scholars and people who have been thinking about this for a long time. And um, I think maybe two pieces maybe for AAPI is one, we can think about it from the framework of imperialism and how imperialism connects us. There's a phrase that I think of a lot that people say, we're here because you were there. We're here because of youth imperialism abroad. And that is something that does connect our communities. But beyond that, are there threads or through lines of solidarity between our communities? Are there ways that we've all fought against imperialism and colonialism? And can that be the through line? Can that be the way that we're in solidarity with each other? And can we use that to name a rationale to organize together for the benefit of all, instead of thinking of it as a zero sum game where like how do we like how can I be in the forefront? It's like how can we fight for each other, right?
Now, to taking a little detour, I kind of want to stay on the subject of Asian identity, and figure out what your thoughts are on a really vocal community of very conservative Asian Americans. So I'm talking about MAGA Asians, Trump Asians, roof Koreans, Asian incels. Um, why do you think so many of these groups of Asian Americans, especially Asian American men, uh, fall into these hyper conservative communities?
There's probably a lot of factors. I don't research this topic specifically, so I don't know if I can speak directly to it, but just a couple of things to give folks context around the term roof Asians. For example, I think that came from the 1992 LA uprising, right? So during the LA uprising, we have a lot of, well, before the LA uprising, we had Korean immigrants, some of them refugees from the Korean American War. So there's a theme of imperialism there. And then more immigrants coming after the 1965 Immigration Act or Hart-Celler Act. So many of them, as they came over, because of capitalism and racism and redlining, like, were not able to find jobs. And the only place they were able to set up shop were in low-income Black communities, largely. Right? So they began to open stores, grocery stores. And so that those factors, right, push factors like imperialism and capitalism, combined with at home with the Black communities, we have long histories of racism, of redlining, and disenfranchisement and deindustrialization, and then now, of course, Black police brutality against our Black communities. So in the 1990s, the kind of two events that catalyzed the uprising, one would be the beating of Rodney King, who was a Black man, and then the acquittal of those policemen, so not holding them accountable. And then also the shooting of Latasha Harlings, a young Black girl, by a Korean American woman in a shop, right, named Sunjatu. So those two events, and it creates this, like, or catalyze this event in which lots of Black and brown youth, largely male, is what I'm understanding from the research, is began to, right, act out. They were out of anger, and rightfully so. And so what happened was a lot of these stores, largely Korean American owned stores, were destroyed in fires. And unfortunately, I think the piece that's really interesting to me is that the media really latched onto this Black Asian conflict trope. So, like, repeatedly showed images of these stores being burned, and then also showed the image that eventually went viral that came to the term roof Korean or roof Asian, of Asian men or Asian store owners on the top of their stores with guns to protect their stores. So that's just to give context where that term came from. So I think that term historically, because of that context, and then with like the more recent 2020 uprising, George Floyd uprising, and then Ferguson a couple of years ago, my understanding is that the term keeps popping up, and when it pops up in these really critical moments, it's used as a wedge against Black and brown communities to say that Asians are going to protect their property. Let's praise Asians for doing this and protecting capitalism, right? But that narrative is really so harmful and erases all the history of Black Asian solidarity through the years. Like going back to the 92 uprising, the media did not at all show stories about Black customers protecting stores or protecting store owners or telling them it's not safe. We're going to get you out of here, right? So I don't know why those things come up, but I guess my first thought is always like, why is it that Asian Americans or Asians at large have been used as wedges, as racial wedges, to create to detract from solidarity, to stop solidarity from happening? It's because they're being used to uphold white supremacy. and to hide the fact that white supremacy, imperialism, capitalism is why these communities are placed in these situations in the first place, right? So how do we have that historical analysis to understand why these situations exist and why these inequities exist in the first place? Yeah, I also think about, recently in January with the Monterey Park shooting in LA, right? And then the Half Moon Bay shooting, both of them were by Asian men, right, perpetrators. And when that happened, I just had to sit down and think about like why did that happen? Um, what were the factors involved systemically at large to create those situations? I don't have a great answer for that. I always rely on scholars because they do great thinking and theorizing, one of which is Dr. Connie Woon. Um, she talks about how like we really have to think about the intersections of racial and patriarchal violence, and she points to the fact that 60% or something of mass shooters have a history of domestic violence. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, how does patriarchy show up in our various communities? And so when those events happened, I talked to my students and I asked them just to think and reflect, right? How do men in their lives, if they come from Asian communities or whatever communities really, like how do men in their lives talk about women, talk to women, whether or not they're in the room, how do they treat them? Because those micro interactions and relationships, one, they show how patriarchy shows up in our communities, and two, they can escalate. And as we've seen in the shootings, they have escalated. Um, it's really heartbreaking to me, but it's also really crucial to me to think about how Black and Asian communities have historically, the media has pitted us against each other, but then how historically, if we really look closely, these communities have, there's always been moments in which we've worked in solidarity with each other, and we've been able to identify larger systemic structures. So that's why plug is why I think ethnic studies is so important. It gives us opportunities to identify the systemic powers, right, and factors, so that we can then move forward. So we can identify what's happening now, and then we can envision a world in which we don't let the media pit us against each other.
I really appreciate you touching on the wedge aspect of what's happening to our communities. Um, and I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about, because you mentioned that, you know, media becomes one of those wedges to highlight certain stories over others. And I'd love to talk about that wedge concept relative to the Stop Asian Hate movement and the way that that's been co-opted by so many different bad actors. Obviously, this isn't to credit the Asian community that is doing foundational great work, but there's a lot of people who are latching onto it, creating fake profiles saying that we're about Stop Asian Hate, but using that as a way to be anti-Black. Can you talk about
Yeah.
like your feelings or just your general analysis of this?
Yeah, that's a great connection and parallel. So, first of all, I think the term "Stop Asian Hate" I have conflict with. I prefer using the term "anti-Asian acts of violence" because that is what it is, right? So that term "stop" or anti-Asian acts of violence helps us identify, hopefully, or point to, like I said, the systemic structures at hand. Historically, there have been anti-Asian acts of violence, since the beginning of United States history. So this isn't something new, first of all, these acts of violence. This is historically just a continued through line. I know with the really like publicized clips of, for example, young Black or brown youth attacking or pushing down Asian elderly, people have went viral, right? They're really alarming images, and the media then latched onto those and began to use this as a narrative to anti-Black narrative, right? But really, again, I think this takes a lot of critical thinking and diving deeper when we look at the actual data. Well, first of all, Black and Brown communities are much more likely to be surveilled. There's just going to be more cameras around, right? So that might lead to these clips being captured. But when we actually look at the data, so I know there's initiative called Virulent Hate Project by University of Michigan. They took all these incidents of anti-Asian acts of violence and kind of organize the data. And what they found was, first of all, going back to our previous question about connecting racism and patriarchy, first of all, 65% of the victims were Asian women. So that's something we have to think about as well. And then if we think about the sources of those acts of violence, who perpetrated them, 77% were white individuals, right? 70% were male. And then 80% were physical, or 80%, right? I've forgotten the number. Let me look real quick. I have it in front of me. Sources of physical harassment were 80% male, right? So those statistics really help us think about, are these clips that the media is presenting, are they accurately representing what's happening with these instances of anti-Asian acts of violence? And then also, I forgot to mention sources of stigmatizing statements by politicians. 95% were by white politicians, right? And then 90% again were by male politicians. So that also to me helps me think about, like, again, these are people in power who have a lot of access to media and influence. So what narrative are they sharing to continue, like you said, to kind of fuel the flames? And how can we look at these data to help us think critically about what's happening? So this is why I also, at my heart, is I really care about abolitionist politics. How can we advocate against anti-Asian acts of violence and also against anti-Black violence as well at the same time, right? To be in solidarity with each other, because the roots of these issues are the same as white supremacy, and we cannot afford to be fighting against each other. So these two questions of like the roof Koreans, and as well as thinking about currently the Stop Asian Hate movement being used as a wedge, they're very much interrelated.
Well, I appreciate you really tying all that in because, I think it can often has to be so easy to fight these individual little battles and not understand that the underlying dirt is all the same. Like you said, it's all white supremacy. If we can dial back the clock a little bit, I want to talk about history, and
Yeah,
I want to talk about uncomfortable history.
sure.
So, what moment in Asian American history keeps you up at night? Like, is there an event, a larger than life figure, or a neighborhood, or a story that you consider a piece that is both uncomfortable but necessary? That, like, okay, we really need to talk about this more.
The event I was thinking about was just the 92 riots, also because I recently taught it with my students. But the shooting of Latasha Harlings is something that I think about a lot. And just like I said in the previous question, how it gives us a chance to really think about anti-Blackness in our own communities, in our Asian American communities, how we have bought into the narratives that media feeds us about anti-Blackness. How can we unlearn those? How can we use history as a North Star to understand, like, this is not something we want to be part of? How can we educate our young people, right, to unlearn their anti-Blackness, to know our history? There's a term that really grounds me, is like know history, KNOW, know self. If we know our history, we know ourselves. If we don't know our history, know history, and we don't know ourselves, right? So what do we know about the histories of communities of color that we live alongside? Let alone ourselves. Do we even know our own histories? And then on top of that, do we know the histories of other people and other communities of color who historically, in parallel ways, have been harmed by white supremacy? and capitalism and imperialism and all of the above, right? That's the history that recently I've been thinking a lot about, because it's painful history, right? But it's also necessary to help us think through solidarity or think through the obstacles there are to solidarity. Yeah.
Like, actually, as a side note, I kind of wanted to pick your brain on what happened in '92, and especially what happened to Latasha Harlins, because it's one of those moments that you really can kind of pinpoint and almost feel like, wow, yeah, that was a really big turning point. Um, and especially looking at, like you said, the history of Black and Asian solidarity, it is sad to see how things pivoted, and um, that moment in particular is something that we continue to go back on. Given that it's been decades since, do you have any reflections as somebody who has thought about this for a long time? Like, you know, is there anything about that event that you've sort of come to realization later on towards your analysis of it? That maybe
New
you,
realizations?
yeah.
Not at this moment. I think it's something that it's a complicated issue to really think through, but at the heart of it is solidarity for me. Um, it actually reminds me of another event that I taught about recently, which is Black Asian solidarity in the New Orleans post Hurricane Katrina. A couple of scholars who write about it. But after Hurricane Katrina, those communities were destroyed, right? Um, and in, I think, New Orleans East, largely Black community, there was a small pocket of Vietnamese refugees or descendants of Vietnamese refugees. And the story goes that right in the aftermath of the Hurricane Katrina, in the span of about a year, the Vietnamese community were able to um, organize and mobilize people to return home to rebuild their neighborhood. Um, and as they were rebuilding, there was another urge by the media to say this is because of the model minority myth. This is because they're self-sufficient and look how amazing they are, right? But the leaders of that community made a concerted effort to say no, like um, so one of the sites that they were able to organize out of was a church building, and the church leader was saying, no, our church was used, we were able to use this site because it just was, it like didn't reach, the floods didn't reach it, it didn't damage it. He said in a couple hours, if the flood had reached it, it would be a totally different story. They wouldn't have had that site. So it's not about self-sufficiency, it's just about the site was available. And in the aftermath, the church leaders or community leaders invited Black communities to come back. Their churches were largely destroyed by the flood. They didn't have a site to worship or come congregate for resources or food. So they invited the Black community to come back to that church site, and they organized together to rebuild their community. So I think in thinking about the 92 event and then also the Hurricane Katrina event, and thinking about how in both situations our government just kind of abandoned those communities, right? For 92, there's a lot of community members were saying, like, where are the police? Well, first of all, police don't really help us, right? But where are the police protecting? They're not going to protect. I think there was a scholar that was saying when she saw how the media was talking about it, it felt like the media was watching them as if it was a dog fight. And then so there's that. And then in New Orleans, this tendency by the media to praise this community, Vietnamese community, and by implicit implicit message then is like, because they're so good, why the Black community not organizing as well, right? But the reality on the ground is very different. Is that they did come together and they fought, for example, a landfill that the city was trying to put right next to the community. Landfill would have been, the city said that it was going to be non-toxic, but but the language, I think, of the landfill is that anything could go in there. So anything meaning anything toxic. And a lot of the Vietnamese community had like gardens that they depended on for food and sustenance. It was an important part of their community. And so if the landfill was there, toxins would have come through to those gardens. So anyways, I think those two events I've been thinking about recently just because I taught about them recently. And I guess new insight for me is really how do we, for me as an educator, how do I share these stories and highlight these stories of solidarity to kind of counteract the media's influence? I think a lot about how there's this concept of like neutrality bias. I don't know if you've heard of it. A neutrality bias, let me see if I can describe it. Neutrality bias is basically this idea that education has to be neutral or objective, right? But I think from a couple scholars, they think about how education has never been neutral. It's always political. Education is about what kind of world are we painting for the students? What kind of social vision are we creating for the future? And so one of the scholars I was thinking about, I forgot his name right now, was saying his example was like if there's advertisements about some kind of product that's painted as neutral, but then if there's protests against that product, that's all of a sudden seen like painted as political, when really the advertisements in the beginning were always political. There's always motivation behind it. So the messages that we send in school or the messages we don't send in school are always political. So in our curriculum, if we have our traditional history narrative, and then we say, oh, by the way, there's Asian American history or Black history or Latino history on the side. The implicit message there is it's not part of our mainstream traditional curriculum. It's not part of our story. It's just this like, side note you can go into if you feel like it. It's not important. So as an ethnic studies teacher, it's really important for me to center those stories instead. Those are our stories, right? Those are the struggles that help shape our understandings of ourselves and our understandings of our relationships with other communities in the present day, and also help give us a vision for what a world could look like if those stories of solidarity are the ones we center. And on top of that, if we're able to help students analyze power. So in these two case studies, analyzing how the media pits communities against each other.
Wow. I mean, I really appreciate you talking about that story about post Katrina, these communities coming together because, like you said, just the selection of which stories to highlight is already the bias, and unfortunately, we do oftentimes focus on how Black and Asian communities have histories of feuding or conflict, but we don't often talk about some of these stories where they do come together. And speaking of stories, on sort of a lighter note, are there any particular Asian American movies, shows, books, stories that you connect with that you would recommend to other Asians? Do you have like a favorite, both from a classical, this was a 20-year classic versus something that's more modern?
I love reading. So I have tons of books that I have in mind. Let me see if I can think of a couple. One thing before I say any recommendations, though, I learned from a friend who showed me this video about this concept of narrative scarcity from the author of Viet Thanh Nguyen. He wrote The Sympathizer. I didn't read the book yet. Heard it was good. But this concept of narrative scarcity is that when there's so little stories about our community in the media, right? Anything that does come out, then there's a lot of pressure on that piece of media to represent everyone. That's impossible. And so the answer to that is we need narrative plenitude. we need more stories from more people in our community, our very diverse communities. The AAPI community is extremely diverse, more than 50 languages represented, right? We need stories from all of us, so that when there is a representational piece, we don't feel a need to have to latch onto it, right? When I talked to my students about that, they were like, some of my like Vietnamese students, for example, were like, yeah, the only thing I saw growing up was Mulan, and I'm not even Chinese. So to that end, there's not that much I think there's more. There's more authors of color, specifically Asian American authors, that are coming up, but there's still not that many to choose from. So let me see. I really liked What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu. It's about her experience with complex trauma, and there's threads of her identity as an Asian American in there. Um, We Too Sing America by Deepa Iyer is a really great historical piece to help. It was helpful to me to understand South Asian identities and how they have felt historically excluded from the AAPI conversation. Anything by Ocean Vuong, the poet and author, is amazing. He's such a powerful writer. Let me see. The Magic Fish is a graphic novel that I really loved recently, by, man, I can't remember the name. Let me look it up. Magic Fish is by Trung Ly Nguyen. Sorry, I'm not Vietnamese. I don't know if I pronounced it correctly. It's about a queer young person, young Vietnamese boy, who is trying to navigate his relationship with his mother, who is a refugee. And they use actually different versions of I think it's the Cinderella story. There's like a Vietnamese version to illustrate their relationship. It's just really so beautiful. And the author actually is in a podcast and mentions how he really wanted to highlight like a hopeful story. So at the end, sorry, spoilers, the young person is able to come out to his mother, essentially, and his mother accepts him. And there's like plenty of stories about, conflict between parents and children, and queer children in particular, but this story was really hopeful because it's hopeful, ends with hopeful note. In terms of movies, I don't know. I really loved Turning Red. I remember I cried. I just felt really connected to that story. I also remember, do you know the short Bow?
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
it was a while ago. I don't know what year it came out. Um, it came out in 2018. Was it really only 2018?
Wow.
I remember I was watching whatever movie it was attached to. I don't even remember at this point. It was like they showed the short in the beginning of the movie.
Hmm.
And I remember I was with my siblings and with my partner, and we just were sitting there in a row, sobbing our eyes out because it just spoke so much to us. And then I remember looking over, and this row of kids who were not Asian, I don't remember what ethnicity or race they were, in front of us, cracking up, laughing because they didn't understand it. They couldn't relate to it, right? And that was really painful to me, right? Anyways, the Bow short was really beautiful. In terms of history, I use Strangers from Another Shore by Ronald Takaki for Asian American history. Asian American Dreams by Helen Zia is a pretty good piece. Um, those are the pieces I can think of from like Asian American authors. And then there's a ton of others that are non-Asian American that, if you're okay with it, I can also share.
Well, I think what we'll do is I'll go grab your recommendation list. We'll go ahead and share with everybody. So if you all want to cross off the to-do list and read through Eunice's recommendations, we'll have that available. Now, for my last question, this is directed towards folks who are still trying to do the work, trying to do better. What message do you have for Asian Americans still trying to unpack their colonial capitalist mindset? How can they develop more of a healthy mindset when it comes to their Asian identity?
I think it comes back to no history, no self. Do you know your history? Right? Do you know your community's history, your family's history? Do you know the ways that US imperialism or militarism or capitalism, all of that has harmed your community? do you know the ways that your community or other communities have come alongside each other to support each other in solidarity movements? Those things have always been really healing for me, really grounding, because if you don't know those things, like how can you move forward? They help us understand who we are in the present, and they help us they give us like direction for the future, I think. And then going back to what I said in the very beginning, I really think it's about being in community, unlearning things that we learned growing up. If we're talking about, like we talked about in the podcast, about patriarchy, um, unlearning those messages are really hard by ourselves. So how can we find people or friends or community members who maybe have more knowledge than you, so you can learn alongside them, read books, right? Um, there's a lot of knowledge out there that for me helped me make sense of who I am. I think that's why ethnic studies is so powerful, because it gives you a sense of who you are and helps us understand the world we live in. And it helps us figure out how to make a better world for ourselves and for each other. It's not easy. So I would just say be in community, right? Find your people.
Awesome. Well, Eunice, it's honestly been an honor to have you on the show. You're always welcome back on LAG Radio. Before we head out, can you please tell us what are you working on these days, and where can the LAG community find support you?
Let me see. I am working on writing some curriculum for a couple of different orgs that a couple of ones that have already been published on the LESMCC website. One in particular I'm very proud of. We had touched on how to think about anti-Asian acts of violence and anti-Blackness collectively. The lesson I wrote recently is about envisioning an abolitionist future for AAPI communities. That lesson I'm very proud of is on the website. I'm also working with the UCLA Asian American Studies Department on their UCLA, what is it called? AAPI Digital Textbook Multimedia Textbook Project. So it's a bunch of scholars and teachers coming together to create curriculum for the masses. There's not that much curriculum out there. So if we want to create ethnic studies programs or Asian American studies programs, we need material from experts. So that's something that I'm excited about. Those are two things. And then in terms of support, I'm really private on social media, but I would just point folks to LESMC's website and Instagram. And I guess people can always contact me if they want to collaborate on stuff. My email is euniceho@ucla.edu. Pretty easy to remember.
Awesome. Well, Eunice, it's been great having you on the show. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Bye.